Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you might be in the world. Welcome to Learn on Demand Systems feature demo, The Secret to Life Cycle Actions. My name is Brian Bork, and I am here with Learn on Demand Systems. I am the Senior Technical Readiness Trainer here at Learn on Demand Systems, and I am very happy to have all of you here. Welcome to the webinar. Before we get started, just a little bit of housekeeping. If you look at your GoToWebinar control panel, you will see a field in the bottom that says questions. When you are there, go ahead and type any questions that you might have as we go through. At the end of the webinar, after we thank you very much for your attendance, we will be happy to address those questions. So please make sure you stick around for the end so that you can hear not only the questions, but the answers as well. And with that, I think we're ready to get into this. Let's talk about life cycle actions. I just want to do a quick sound check here, and yep, just wanted to make sure everything was coming through loud and clear. All right, so what are life cycle actions and what can it do for you? And I want you to think about this as the perfect possibility. Imagine a completely reusable lab. In order to get a completely reusable lab, you have to have a base machine or cloud slice or some sort of technology. You need a set of instructions, and then you need some sort of ability to be able to customize that base machine in order to meet the needs of those instructions. And we'll give you some examples in a little bit. But life cycle actions, or LCAs, are really a collection of tools that you can use. And when we talk about tools, there are different times when you can use those tools. For example, if you're trying to put a nail in a wall, it's probably better to get the hammer. And if you're trying to pull the nail out of the wall, it's probably better to use like either a claw hammer or a crowbar or pry bar or something like that. And so there are different tools you use at different times for the same thing. And the tool analogy works here because we are building tools that you can use at various points. Life cycle actions can be applied at various times and have various triggers. They can be in various formats. Some of the examples we'll show you will be PowerShell and command line and bash. And you can apply these at different times. For example, when the lab is starting, or after the lab has finished starting, or before it's built, or just after it's built, or when it's tearing down. There's all sorts of triggers, and we'll show you those in the demonstration. So this has been the most sought after requests that we get from customers. Is there a way of taking a single lab, a single virtual machine perhaps, or a single configuration, and reusing that across the board? So I have one virtual machine and I use it for 150 different labs. This LCA allows you to configure that in a easy to use method. Now, I want to give you sort of an idea of how far you can take this. So let's take a look at some ideas for use. Imagine a lab that requires something be done before the user signs on. Now, this gives you the ability to customize the environment without having the user sign on and customize it for themselves. It's a good idea. A lab that requires something to be done before the lab is complete or canceled. When the user clicks on I'm done with this lab or goes to end their lab, then you can have it trigger and do some other things where, for example, imagine a user has to upload some files. make sure those files finish uploading before the lab itself is canceled and or completed. Imagine a lab where after a user resumes the lab, for example, let's say that on Monday they use the lab, Monday night they save their lab, on Tuesday morning they come in and resume, you want certain actions to take place when they resume. For example, maybe you wanted to check and make sure that the lab files that are being used are the most up to date. An example of a lab that needs to start, obtain an IP address, and then perform certain actions on that IP address. We even have a trigger that's specifically for when the lab obtains an IP address. And then last but not least is an example, and these are just meant to be things to get you thinking. They're not meant to be the only, this isn't a limitation. This is meant to open your eyes and make you think about what you could do. A break fix lab. Imagine being able to start off with a lab that is perfectly fine, and then you have the user save their lab as they're working with it. And then when they resume, you have a script that runs, or you send commands to that lab that break the lab and then require the user to fix the lab. So those are circumstances that might be examples of what you want to use. Now, again, I'm going to be talking a little bit about virtual machines, and I'm also going to be talking about using this in an example where we might want to send lifecycle action information out to a cloud service like either Azure or AWS. So we're going to talk about all of these possibilities. Now, I'm just about to get into the demonstration, but before I get into the demonstration, I want to give you a bit of background here. We're going to look at 3 examples of lifecycle actions. In the first example, we have a base lab that is designed and locked into place, and it's used by dozens of labs. So we can't change the base lab at all, but the base lab has a drive letter of F, as in Frank. Then you have a set of instructions that can't be changed at all because they come from a third party or something like that. And those require a drive letter E. We don't have a drive letter E, we only have a drive letter F. How can we make this work? Well, lifecycle actions to the rescue. I'll show you what that looks like. In a slightly more sophisticated example, we're going to take a look at a lab that does what a lot of labs do, and that is that it always tries to apply Windows updates even after you've turned the service off. And if you've always wondered, well, how does it turn that service back on, or how does it know that there are Windows updates that need to be applied even though I've turned the service off? Well, we're going to take a look at why that happens and how you can correct that action. And then finally, in a third example, which we're going to look at the code, but we're not going to see the end result, and I'll explain why when we get into the lab, we have a lab that spins up a virtual machine and then connects to Azure. In Azure, we need to prep a bunch of resources for each user, and each user only gets their environment once they click on the launch button. So how can we make this happen? We actually spin up a set of data bricks in Azure. We connect to a cluster. Well, we create a cluster, we connect to it, and we populate it all before the user signs on to the lab itself. It's a really, really super complicated, sophisticated example, but it's designed to show you what sort of functionality you might want to use in the future. So with all that being said, it's time to actually get in here and see this in action. I'm going to switch from my slides to my desktop, and we are going to be taking a look. I've already gone in and gotten to the pages where lifecycle actions actually take place. And you can see here that I have our first example, the one that we were talking about, which is changing a drive letter to E. If you wonder where lifecycle actions is, or how you have it, or where you go and edit it, it is inside your edit lab profile or create lab profile page, and it's a couple tabs over. Now, you may not have all of these tabs depending on what type of lab developer you are, but you will always have a lifecycle action. So don't count on the number of tabs across the top, just look for the one that says lifecycle. You can then add lifecycle actions quickly and easily just by clicking on the button down here, and then you can put this in. Now, while we're talking about lifecycle actions, I'll come back to this and show you how you can put the information in just a moment. All right, so here is our change drive letter to E. So remember our circumstance, we have a virtual machine that can't be changed that has a drive letter of F, and we have a set of instructions that can't be changed that refer to drive letter E. So what we have here is we have a lifecycle action which executes a script inside of a virtual machine. It is being triggered by what is called the first displayable. And then what virtual machine we're applying it to, the command type of PowerShell. And I had mentioned that we were working with either PowerShell, Command Shell, or Bash. All of our examples in this particular case are going to be using PowerShell because it gives us the most power and capability. You'll see that this has a slight delay of 20 seconds, and then the error action is the default, which is to log and that it's enabled. Now here's the actual command. Nothing complicated. If we wanted to, we could have the user run this command and do it for themselves as they log in. But where are you going to do that? You can't edit the instructions and you can't edit the virtual machine. So you're kind of stuck. This lifecycle action gives you a way out of being stuck. So I am going to fire this up and then I'm going to come back while the lab is starting to be able to show you. Now, the reason I didn't fire this up in advance is because I want to show you that this actually takes place in real time when the lab is starting up. If I don't log on to the lab, it will still happen with or without me. So let me switch over to launch this lab. Hold on one second. Here we go. And while the lab is starting, I'll go ahead and edit my profile and go back to the lifecycle action and talk about some of the fields that we have. Notice our name field is just what we're going to call this, but we have send web request, send notification to user in the lab interface, send an email to user, execute script in virtual machine, execute script in container, or execute script in cloud platform. So what I want to show you here is that this scripting that I'm showing here could be applied to a container or a cloud platform if that was set up in this lab profile. It's not, but as you'll see in other examples, it will be. But some of the other things that you can do, like when a lab is complete or when a lab is being built, you can have it send a get or a put to a website, for instance. You can do all sorts of really, really cool things. Now, the event is the trigger. So we can do it pre-build, which is before the lab actually starts to launch. You can do it post-build, which means the lab is built, but it is not yet reported in. First displayable is the most commonly used. IP address assigned, we mentioned that previously. Then there's saving, saved, resuming, resumed, tearing down, and tore down. So that gives you a lot of options for that. So my lab should be ready here. Let me just switch back to it. There we go. I'll show while starting, and you will see here my lab is in the process of starting up, but let me show you what the sort of holdup is or what the requirement is. Remember, the virtual machine can't be edited because it's used by a bunch of labs, and the instructions come from somebody else, so we can't edit the instructions, but we want them in here. So how do we make this work? Well, the instructions have you sign on. As you'll see, as soon as this lab finishes loading, it will automatically sign me on. And then once it signs me on, I will be through steps 1 and 2. Then there is this script that downloads lab files, and this script allows the user to get the most up-to-date lab files from a GitHub repository, which is great, except for the fact that it's only going to work with an E drive. Remember, we can't edit these instructions. So how do we unify this? How do we make this happen? So as soon as this signs in and the screen refreshes here, you will see that we will get full control of the desktop. There it goes. This is what happens when you start the lab, or when you connect to the lab ahead of when it's ready. There we go. That's exactly what I want to see. Now, if I look here inside of my virtual machine, you will see that I have an all files F. Now, I've got to let this wait a little bit because remember, we put a delay in, and this takes a little bit to actually get to the point where it processes. But what will happen is within the next minute, you will see that this file explorer I have open will disappear. And when I review it, there it disappeared. And now when I review it, you will see that my drive has changed to E. I didn't have to modify, I didn't have to capture a diff disk, I didn't have to do anything. And now when I download the lab files, they will appear inside of the E drive. And you can see here that it's in the process of getting started. Now this does take a little bit of time to download because it goes out to GitHub and gets a bunch of files and puts them in place. But I want you to think about the possibilities here. Just because you have a VM that is restricted, or just because you have instructions that are restricted, you can overcome those without using a differencing disk. So there's some real power here. All right, so let's go ahead and end this one, and we're going to switch to a different example, which is still relatively simple, but a little bit more sophisticated in what it's delivering. And again, you notice that we're using the first displayable, and we're going to be submitting these to the VM and using PowerShell just like we were before. Now, in this case, I have pre-run this lab and got it started so that you can see what the end result is. But here's the problem. When you turn off the Windows service, the Windows Update service, excuse me, there's a monitor service that is always being, or I shouldn't say always, but is occasionally going out and checking to see if the Windows Update service has been turned off, and if so, turn it back on and then have it go out and do a check. That service is called the Windows Update Service Medic, the Windows Update Medic service. That's it. And so what we need to do is, the problem is you can't really turn that service off, but we can break that service. So what we're doing is, with this particular lab profile, we are submitting this information. And by the way, this is being submitted to one of two lab profiles. If I wanted to submit it to both, I would have to make a separate set of lifecycle actions for that other lab profile, or for that other virtual machine profile, excuse me. So here we are with the stopped updates, and this is just a collection of scripts, or a collection of PowerShell commands that actually turns off the Windows Update service and tries to turn off the Medic service as well. And then there's a second option which not only turns it off, but then goes in and breaks it by changing a DLL to DL1 and making it so that the current user that's logged in is the owner of it, so that the system can't turn it back on. This means that every time you start up this lab and these lifecycle actions are applied, it really kills the Windows Update service. Important caveat here, if your lab requires the use of update services, you will need to disable these labs, these lifecycle actions, by clicking on this and then checking the box for enabled. And when I click on OK, you'll see that it grays it out. It doesn't get rid of it, it's just not going to apply it. So you would turn both of those off and then use it. So let me bring up my example here running, and you'll see that I have my virtual machine. And if I sign on, if I go in and take a look at my services, and I scroll down as soon as this comes up to the Windows Updates, you will see that the Windows Update service is disabled, and the Windows Update Medic service is not only disabled, but it's giving an error. It can't read. That's because we broke it. We made it so that it actually can't start up. Not only because of who the owner is, but because we broke the DLL and changed the permission of the DLL. Now, if you left this running for a certain amount of time, Windows itself will repair this and will go out and turn this medic service back on. The length of time varies, but in a typical lab where you're using it for less than a day, it typically does not turn itself back on and repair. So you can see how you can take a lab that is a great lab, but it just keeps applying Windows updates, and you can fix it with a lifecycle action without doing all of this stuff and capturing a diff disk. Once again, for example, if you can't capture a diff disk. So I'm going to end this one, and now my next lab that I'm going to show you is our large example. Now, our large example is this is a real world example. It was used for an event, and what it did was it collected a bunch of information when the user clicked on, or when the instance was spun up. It got the user account and the password and the resource group that was given to this user. And you'll notice that this is being submitted to a cloud platform. So this is being submitted to Azure, and it is being done post-build, not first displayable. The reason why it is doing that is because this is going to be something that is out in Azure, not in the virtual machine. So you don't have to worry about waiting for it to be displayable. But you can see here that this is a sophisticated example. We're tying in multiple pieces where we're getting an API key specifically for a user. We're creating a cluster. And then once we've done that, that's in the first build or after built. Then now we get first displayable, and now we're creating a Gen 2 storage using a cluster and connecting and populating it. And this is a huge full-on PowerShell script that has error checking and all sorts of other stuff in it as well. This script, and this is an important note to keep in mind, this script takes up to 40 minutes to finish populating, which means that if you have an all day long class and you're going to be using this, or a multiple day class and you're going to be using this, it is important to remember that you have the users launch their lab and then don't touch it while you go on to introduce the topic and talk about what they're going to be doing and go through a lot of the instructor-led portion before you actually have them get started with the hands-on portion. So it would be a launch, talk, then do the lab. In other cases, we can do things where we can spin these up behind the scenes and then make them available per user after they have completed. But it's a huge example of taking a lab and not just using it to fix something in the lab, but to actually give the user a fully populated Azure environment, which has a whole complete setup done to it, which is the important part of the lab. You don't want to teach them how to build Databricks. You don't want to teach them how to build a cluster. You want to provide them that and then carry on. This is the exact same thing as giving somebody a pre-deployed Active Directory structure with a couple of domain controllers, some member servers, and clients. Instead of giving them a non-built environment where you have them do all of that, you give them that pre-built and you make it so that it's available. And again, you could take these lifecycle actions to the point of installing and configuring SharePoint, for instance, automatically with certain conditions. There's all sorts of very, very cool technologies you can do, but you have to remember that if you're teaching a one-day class and if your lab takes an hour to get started, you have to make sure that you plan accordingly for the type of delivery you're going to do. All right, let's bring back our slide here. And we will continue on. Here are some resources available for you. To learn about lifecycle actions, we have a documentation set up inside of our system. Not only do we have a search feature where you could do a search for these various words like LCA or lifecycle action, but we also have an A to Z index in the documentation. So if you go to LODS period ONE, or as I call it, LODS.1, /documentation and go into the A to Z index, any one of these features will be available to you. Cloud security, which talks about how you can use lifecycle actions to secure your cloud slice. IDLX lab variables, lifecycle actions, variable display for lab, and just modifying your instructions. So if you need more information about that, please go to LODS1 /documentation. We have a very important, very special event coming up next Tuesday, July 21st. Hear from our CEO, Corey Hines, about the newest innovations that have come from Learn on Demand systems, as well as what's coming in the future. The registration link will be in the follow-up email for today's webinar. And last but not least, we have additional webinars coming up next week. Well, I should say, next week we have the important CEO message. Then on Thursday, July 23rd, we have a feature demo with tips and tricks on delivering virtual classes. And then we start back with our typical Tuesday, July 28th solution overview, which is LODS.1/overview. And just a reminder, you can get this demo or this feature demo as well as register for future demos at LODS1/feature demos. A quick reminder that you can type your questions into the questions field down at the bottom of the control panel. And with that, I want to thank you, and I will be happy to address any questions that come up.